Okay, unless you've totally had your head in the sand, you've seen that there's been a shit ton of election fraud news in the last couple of weeks. I'm going to try to condense that as quickly and simply as possible. So the fraud that occurred was numerous, various, and just, it was everywhere. It was rather unbelievable. There was more than one fraud method used, which makes the subject a little bit more complicated, because all of the fraud methods need to be scrutinized and fixed so that they can't happen again. First, it has to be established that the fraud was present, that it modified the outcome, and then it has to be going forward that shit can't ever happen again. So some people are probably a little bit confused because they don't realize that there's more than one type of fraud, and that some of these lawsuits that have been filed are dealing with only one type, while some are dealing with all of the different types, trying to lump them together. And all of these lawsuits have failed at the state level for the most part, and people think that means that it's all bullshit. Well, it's not bullshit. Okay? It's not. There was vast, rampant election fraud, and I'm going to go over only a portion of it because I've been posting videos on my channel, but just look at the simplest way to look at this. There's a time crunch, obviously, on the presidential inauguration and also on the elector selection. And due to the time crunch, some of these lawsuits have been hasty. And I would also have to mention, for those of you who don't seem to have this understanding of the differentiation, not all of these lawsuits were filed by Sidney Powell. Not all of these lawsuits were filed by Giuliani and Jenna Ellis. Okay, these lawsuits were filed by different groups in various states who wanted to seek justice and relief. And, you know, they're not specifically the most interested party, and courts hear suits based on a lot of different factors, including if the person who is filing the lawsuit is going to benefit. You know, you can't, like, for example, you can't just go into court and file a lawsuit on behalf of your neighbor because your neighbor got screwed over on something if your neighbor has no interest themselves in pursuing the lawsuit. You can do it on someone's behalf when they need your help, but you can't do it on their behalf just because you want to. It's kind of the point. And I have a feeling that some of these state lawsuits weren't filed in the smartest way. But that's not even the interesting part. I'm just going to try to keep this short and interesting. So, if nothing else, if everything else aside and ignoring the time crunch, you can look on my channel where I reposted from the live feeds of the witness testimony. I did not get Pennsylvania in there, but I did get the state of Arizona, the state of Michigan, and a little bit of the state of Georgia. I have not yet seen the Wisconsin ones. I don't know if anything has happened in Wisconsin, or if anything is if we're going to have a Senate Oversight Committee hearing here, because right now Giuliani apparently has COVID, so I don't know if that's going to go forward. But what I can tell you is this: if you listen to all these individual people, their individual stories from state to state to state, something is fucking wrong. This shit was scandalous. And there is no way that many people coordinated in such a short time all these stories and all their testimony about fraud. I mean, just saying as a generalization, if there wasn't fraud, then all of these affidavits and all of this testimony would be the greatest orchestration of fraud, especially in such a short amount of time, that's ever been perpetuated on the American public. So essentially, the election is a huge fraud, or everybody saying the election is a fraud is the hugest fraud. It's really that simple. And I'm going to go with the election because of logic and because of the fact that I watched those people's testimony. Now, the problem is also that some of these people's testimony was anecdotal or circumstantial. So you need to have a basic understanding of the difference between factual evidence, circumstantial evidence, and anecdotal evidence. Now, you can get a conviction on circumstantial evidence to some extent. You can definitely get a conviction on criminal. And factual evidence, for sure, You cannot get a conviction on anecdotal evidence, though anecdotal evidence is a nice part of a narrative to add to an argument when you're trying to prove a point. So, that being said, and this isn't criminal, at least at this point, this is all civil lawsuits, the anecdotal evidence really, I think that the main reason that these oversight committees, and especially the Trump legal team and Powell's legal team, allowed this anecdotal evidence that was presented to be presented, or the testimony that had factual evidence mixed with anecdotal or mixed with statements like, well, in my opinion, from what I saw, witness testimony is valid, and that is factual. But whenever you talk about something that you heard somebody else saw, or you heard that somebody else heard, or something like that, that's third party, becomes hearsay. Therefore, the evidence becomes anecdotal, if not inadmissible. And some of the testimony was like that. Why was that allowed by these legal teams, by these intelligent lawyers? You know, if you read Twitter, it was allowed by them because they're morons and don't know what they're doing. But that's not it. It was allowed because it presents the case more well-rounded to the average American person who decides to watch it and get a feel for what's going on. Because, you know, when you're talking to somebody who worked at any one of these polling places, in any one of these positions, adjudicator, poll watcher, etc., you know that if you're talking to them in a one-on-one situation, or if you're just sitting down with them and saying, okay, tell me what happened, you know that at some point you are going to say, because you're in a human experience talking to another person, you're going to say, well, dude, what was the feel you got from this? I heard everything you said. It sounds fucked up, but what's your feeling? You are going to ask that question. Now, that question only matters to a tiny extent in a court of law. Often it doesn't matter, but yes, that stuff was included. So now, the difference between those three types of evidence, just keep that in mind. And fuck all the lawsuits that were already thrown out, not relevant. Let's not even talk about those. The important lawsuit is the lawsuit that was filed early this morning or very late last night by the state of Texas. So the state of Texas just filed a lawsuit. We're going to go over that one just a little bit. And it is itself the plaintiff, and the defendants in that lawsuit are Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Now, why did they not include more states in there? I'm guessing brevity. They feel that they probably could have put 8 states in there, and that those 4 are the strongest. And also from reading through there, it sounds like, and from watching the witness testimony, it sounds like just about every state had some level of election fraud. That if we were really to try to really search the true number of real votes that this election garnered for each candidate, that we might find that every single state flipped votes for Biden. That means even Alabama, where Trump won by like 75, 80%, something where it's just, you know, irrefutable by any math. Even there, he might have won by a little more. It's not pertinent to pursue it. And the same thing in a state like New York, where Biden won by a large margin, but it may turn out his margin wasn't as large as it was presented. It was increased by 10%, but it doesn't matter because he won by a higher percentage than that. It's still important going forward, but all I'm saying is that for now, those kinds of things don't really mean anything. For now, let's talk about what Texas is doing. So they go after Pennsylvania. They have a specific section for Pennsylvania, and then they have their generalized thing about how all of them violated law. The premise of this lawsuit and the way that this lawsuit is different than the others is that it specifically targets constitutional law precedent. I certainly haven't read all the cases that they cited. I'm going to assume that their citations are accurate. The couple that I did recognize, they sounded accurate. So this lawsuit's based entirely on constitutional law, and Texas alleges that these other 4 states denied them the right to have the correct outcome of the election based on the fact that each of the states had its own various fraud, and therefore the relief that they are seeking is that the court overturn not the election results, but that the court overturn or instruct the state legislatures to pick the correct corresponding electors for what the outcome of the election should have been counted correctly. Now, the the two genius things about this lawsuit that my pedestrian mind sees is that, first of all, it's completely constitutional law, which makes it streamlined and fucking easy for everybody to understand, and it makes it relevant to the Supreme Court. And second, that it cuts out the examination of all the fraud to the point where you need to review every single witness's testimony and test the validity of the information that can be determined to be factual versus anecdotal or circumstantial. So it essentially says that if you have seen all of this that's been going on, and if you understand that this fraud exists, and if you take it on good faith that if you've heard 100 stories about fraud that all seem to come from credible witnesses, and that 300 stories may exist, at this point you do not need to review the additional 200 that you haven't reviewed yet. You can take it in mass that this fraud was present and occurred in the same or similar manner as described by other affiants. All that means is that it makes it a little bit easier for the court to stay focused on the idea of whether or not what the state of Texas is claiming violates the Constitution and constitutional law, or whether or not it doesn't. It takes away the additional time and arduousness of examining every single piece of evidence, and further, it deprioritizes the scrutiny of the electric voting machines and vote tallying, because that is a problem unto itself. But they realize that with the mail-in voting aspect alone, they can prove that the election was fraudulent based on the fact that the mail-in ballots were unprecedented, were increased significantly. No states were set up to handle it. No state legislatures approved the very recent changes that all the state people in charge in the state, secretaries of state or other various heads, made unilaterally without congressional approval from the state, and that most simply, of all the different ways that the mail-in ballot was used, most of them were taken without signatures, and many of them were sent out without solicitation. Because every state has a law talking about who is allowed to vote by absentee ballot and by what steps are required to get an absentee ballot. So if you don't understand that, real simply, you're only supposed to get an absentee ballot if there's a good reason that you're not going to be able to vote in person. You're not supposed to get an absentee ballot just because you don't feel like going to the polls. Actually, vote in person has been the goal of every election for forever. And that is the way that it's supposed to be. And it's because this is not the first time that mail-in ballots or other alternative methods to voting in person have been wrought with fraud, or potentially wrought with fraud, where everybody just said, man, the easiest way to do this is just to do in-person voting. And so quite simply, if you're not in the military, which would make you potentially outside of the US, but definitely outside of your voting area at the time of an election, or if you don't have a debilitating illness, and a lot of people with debilitating illnesses probably don't give a fuck to vote because their illness is that debilitating, but some that do, you can request a mail-in ballot, or if there's for some reason you have to be traveling at that time. But aside from that, which should always be a very small fraction of people, there really is no cause to be able to legally request a mail-in ballot. Of course, that's changed in some states in the last couple of months because they used the coronavirus as an excuse, but that, I'm not even going to get into that argument whether or not it's valid, though I don't think it is. The point is that absentee ballots and mail-in ballots, which are not the same thing, there is never supposed to be a quantity of those in any jurisdiction where they should affect the outcome of the election. Essentially, they're given to people so that they can feel that they still participated. So the genius of this lawsuit is that he's pitting one state against another, and therefore it gives the Supreme Court jurisdiction. The genius of the lawsuit is that it's showing that Texas will be affected by the outcome should fraudulent states cast electoral. It's all around smart. And I'm going to look at the state of Wisconsin. specifically, just a couple of lines, because to me it was very interesting. But the only other thing that I would say about this in general is that, I looked at Twitter once I saw that this was filed. And like I said, it was filed very late last night or first thing this morning. So this is new news as of right now. I mean, it's only a couple hours old. I don't know how long it'll be by the time I get done editing. But this is new news. And when I looked on fucking Twitter, okay, just because I figured that, they're going to be a bunch of fucking lefties and Democrats that are going to see what happened, and they're going to be like, all right, let's take a shit on this and, say our negative things, but it's all fake and bullshit anyway. And here I am looking for this stuff on Twitter, and they're doing the same thing that they did when the fraud hearings were taking place. You want to know what that is? There was no talk of it on Twitter. I'm sure there were plenty of people on the right that were talking about it, but for the most part, they were either censored, had the little warning pop up. I can tell you what certainly didn't happen is it didn't take on a precedent with the algorithm. There was no trending hashtag, regardless of how many people may have been talking about it. I expected the left to be on it and be talking shit about how these witnesses are bull, but really for the most part they just ignored it, and they're doing the same thing to this lawsuit. That's how serious the stuff is. They're not even trying to get on top of it and call it BS. They're just trying to ignore it, hoping that most people don't hear about it, because the narrative that they're going to want to push is that Trump wins and that he was installed like a chancellor instead of elected like a president. That is exactly what they're going to try to do. They're going to hedge their bets and assume that he wins, and they're going to save their vitriol and propaganda for that. They're just trying to ignore this, hoping that Americans don't see it. The highlights, man. I think one of the most interesting lines in the entire thing is that, mathematically speaking, with the lead that Donald Trump had at 3 a.m. on election nights on the morning of November 4th, regardless of how many mail-in ballots had been counted at that point by these municipalities, the mathematical odds of Biden beating Trump was 1 in 1 quadrillion. And the possibility of Biden winning all 4 of those states, from where the numbers were at that point, morning of November 4th, 3 a.m., the possibility of him winning all 4 of those, and it was noted also that Hillary Clinton outperformed him in every state and in every county that they're talking about right now. His odds of winning all 4 of those are 1 in 1 quadrillion to the 5th power. You understand what that fucking means? You could win the Powerball like fucking 100,000 times over before that's a possibility. Okay? Give you a little perspective there. And then as far as Wisconsin goes, every state had good stuff. I'm just going to touch on a little thing about Wisconsin. Wisconsin has some very strict laws about absentee ballots and about signature verification. I remember when I was younger, you didn't need to have an ID to vote. You were allowed to take a piece of mail, like an electric bill with your name on it. And I remember when that changed. And I remember at the time thinking like, oh, that's kind of fucked. Why would I want to have of ID? But then I thought, I thought about it later, and especially now, years later, and I'm like, the reason that I was even mad about that, because I never understood why they wanted an ID in the first place. The reason I was mad about that was because a lot of the people at the polls were mad about that. Not the people voting, but the people who were running the polls, the election people. They were real shitty, and all they were doing was complaining about it, and I bet you the press, the local press in the area was complaining about it too. All Democrats, they were the ones that were bitching about it. And they were talking about voter disenfranchisement. And I'm thinking to myself, the next time I went to vote, when I had my ID, I'm like, this really isn't that complicated. And honestly, it makes a lot more sense for me to show my ID than it does to bring a fucking piece of mail. I mean, I could bring anybody's piece of mail. Unless they're writing down your height, your weight, physical attributes, and they're comparing that. I mean, how much work would that be? So really, it makes a fuckload more sense to bring an ID. And I thought to myself after that, I don't know what they're talking about with this disenfranchisement or whatever, but I don't get it. So Wisconsin's always had very strict laws about absentee vote and signatures have to match, and there's only certain reasons you can have an absentee, and one of the things they did was switch one of the reasons you were allowed to have an absentee. They just did this a couple months ago. You were allowed to claim that you were indefinitely confined because of COVID, which is something that they created. So that's a bullshit thing. And they also allowed the use of election drop boxes, which not all places did. And I remember that, and I remember thinking to myself that that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Now, that violates state statute. Every state has some kind of statute saying that you can't use a drop-off point, that the ballot has to be handed to somebody hand-to-hand in a certain location, like in the city hall, from the person who cast the ballot, or in some cases you can have someone else deliver it for you, but there's still a chain of custody, essentially, where you have to verify who it came from and who the person is delivering it. Or it could be mailed in, but it had to be mailed into a certain address and, of course, received by a certain date. So they changed all those laws so that mail-in ballots could essentially be counted from anybody who decided to mail one in. The only difference between Wisconsin and Michigan, the only reason Michigan was a lot worse, was because in Michigan they were allowed to send out unsolicited mail-in ballots to people whether they requested them or not. Wisconsin tried to do that, and I remember that somehow that got stopped. The other stuff they wanted to change, they managed to change that, but they couldn't send out the mail-in ballots. At least I didn't see them in my county. But what they did do in place of that, this is part of the fraud, but again, it's way off the point of what this lawsuit is or what's going to win in court. What they did do was they allowed these places that call themselves bipartisan or nonpartisan to send out mailers, and believe me, I got hundreds of them, saying that they were from voter registration. They wanted to encourage people to learn how to vote, and that they weren't partisan, but really if you spent enough time on whatever website they tried to direct you to, which supposedly was just to tell you what district or ward you were in and to show you a sample ballot, and all the sample ballots would only have Democrats on them if you would go to them. I mean, it was a different type of fraud. It was more like a conspiracy than a fraud to hold sway over the outcome of the election. But again, way off the point for what this lawsuit is. But I saw that. And so when they said this in this lawsuit, now the stuff about Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia, I can only go from what I saw in the testimony and what I understand from what they're printing in the stuff about state code. It all tracks logically, but I don't know. The stuff about Wisconsin, I know factually. So reading that, I was like, yep. And so if this is accurate to the level that I understand it to be, then these other state stuff is accurate too. So here's Texas looking for relief, and they even specify in there that, because the big question now is going to the big question now is not going to be whether or not this wins. It's going to be whether or not the Supreme Court will hear it. Because there's no way that this can't win, because it's clear-cut constitutional law. There's really no way that it can't win. It's whether or not the Supreme Court is going to hear it. So they are going to have to decide that. And I don't know how they do that, if they do that by a majority vote or if it has to be unanimous. And I don't know that if there are 9 justices and 5 are willing to hear it and 4 aren't, if it can be heard by a body of 5. I don't think it can work that way. Now, I know that the Supreme Court doesn't have to have all 9 people. I think the minimum amount for a Supreme Court ruling is 5. So that's why, like, for example, if Amy Coney Barrett didn't get confirmed and they only had 8 justices, they could still hear cases, which I thought that was weird, but that's how it is. They were 2 justices down and they only had 7, they could still hear cases. But in any event, I don't know what is required for them to decide to hear the case, but they're going to have to figure that out. That's going to be the big news, though. If they say they're going to hear the case, this has to go the way that it's filed, because it's just too clean. It was well written. The only thing I can't break down is the case law, because I don't know enough about U.S. case law as they cite it, and I'm not going to read all that because that would just fucking blow up my mind. And I don't need to, because I'm not the lawyer and I'm not a judge. But it looks good, and it's huge news, and you're not going to see it really anywhere. So what is the mainstream media talking about this morning? Well, so far I haven't seen them talk about this. And so what is Twitter talking about this morning? Okay, so with the Twitter hashtag, when it trends, 10,000 to 15,000 tweets on a hashtag, sometimes even less, will make something trend. 10 to 15,000, because they tell you the number, hashtags of one thing will make something trend at the top of the list. So every once in a while, you'll see something with between 20 and 3,000 tweets on a hashtag. That is a very, very popular subject. Okay? I want you to keep that in mind, because this morning when I went and looked at Twitter to see if they were jumping on it, now there was nothing there. You know what the top Twitter hashtag and discussed subject was? That alien life and the alien federation is real, and that the state of Israel has been communicating with an alien federation of planets that has decided that the rest of the world is not ready to know about their existence yet. Do you know how many tweets with that hashtag and that subject matter there were? Remember, I said 10 to 15,000 is easily enough to get to the top of the hashtag list on trending. And 20 to 30 is substantial. 85,000 tweets about fucking potential alien life. 85,000 tweets. And nothing about the Texas lawsuit in the Supreme Court. That's it.